Welcome Between the Whistles. I'm your host, Joe Chapp, Detroit Lions news podcast on Between the Whistles Sports. Today we're going to be talking about something I have to just say. It's been a remarkable turnaround from Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell to turn this organization around into a team that is literally on the cusp of something great. You look at what they've been able to do in the last couple of years with the draft classes, with the free agent signings, with the hires and the coaching staff. One of the things that Dan Campbell really was underestimated about what he did when he came in was Don Capers as the senior assistant to Aaron Glenn. And this year he brings in John Fox to help Aaron Glenn. And John Fox is he's been a head coach before. He's been a part of some really good defenses. He's took a team to the Super Bowl. It's a great guy to have on your staff. You know, the reversal from what happened with the Quinn and Patricia era to what we have now in Detroit is pretty remarkable. And Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, they deserve all the credit in the world because what they've been able to do is make this team competent to where you should expect to go to the playoffs. You should expect to win playoff games. You should expect a Super Bowl. I don't think that's out of the question. It's the Detroit Lions, this I was talking to a player a couple weeks ago or whatnot, and he said when Patricia was here and Quinn, it was a dead franchise basically. And he said what Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes did is they came in and they revived it and made it whole again. What you're seeing from the Detroit Lions is what we expected to see earlier, from other general managers. It just never happened. And a lot of people put their trust in Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, and they have the trust of the fan base because I'm pretty sure if you ask anybody that's a Lions fan, if Brad Holmes goes out and drafts someone that you don't like or that you don't think is good, you're gonna trust the guy because of what he's been able to accomplish as a general manager drafting for the Detroit Lions. Jeff Okudah being traded for a fifth round pick. You got to remember, look at the late round picks that he's had: James Houston, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Malcolm Rodriguez, Derek Barnes. There's been a lot of good players that have came from those late round picks. Brad Holmes has shown that this team is heading in the right direction, and Dan Campbell has shown that he has the coaching staff heading in the right direction. I always think it's funny because I talked to someone and he's in the NFL. He works for another team in the AFC, and he literally told me the other day. He said, it used to be when you heard Detroit was in front of you, you were like, yes, because you always knew that they would screw the pick up. But now it's more like, oh, okay, if you pick in front of the Detroit Lions and they pick a player behind you, you're going to be following that player for the next 3 years, at least. I remember he was telling me a story how, the tennis, it was the team that he was playing, he works for, and they were looking at a guy named Amon-Ra St. Brown in perhaps like the 6th or 7th round. And, they said this, there's not a lot of good grades on him. And Brad Holmes took him, and they were like, "That's way too early." Brad Holmes took him. I'm forgetting what round, but he took him early, and they thought it was way too early, and it paid off. Brad Holmes has earned credibility within the NFL of how good of a general manager he is, and I think he's got a few moves up his sleeve as we get towards draft day. But listen, the route this organization has gone in the last 2 to 3 years, from Quinn and Patricia to Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell cleaning up the mess, and in the time that they've cleaned up the mess, I think a lot of people didn't expect them to be as good as they were last year. I mean, I thought they would be 9-7. 9-8. But I didn't think they would be as good as they were later in the year. And that's a credit to Dan Campbell, Brad Holmes, because the players that they believed in paid off. And obviously Brad Holmes he's came into this offseason. He's made defensive, really emphasis on the free agency market, getting 3 corners. Obviously signed David Montgomery, which is a great signing. I love that signing, and I'll get into that why I love that signing in a later video. But just talking to that guy today that works for another NFL team, and him saying that the Detroit Lions are a team that you once thought they were just a funny organization that would always screw something up, to now people are starting to take notice of what the Detroit Lions are doing. This isn't the NFL. This isn't fans, or this isn't fans of other teams. This is in the NFL. I was really happy to know that, because I think, you know what, if you're a Detroit Lions fan, you've been waiting long enough. You have been waiting so long for a competent franchise. And I mean, listen, you've had Barry, you've had Megatron, you've had Stafford, and within those times, you've never had a general manager that could put the talent on the field to compete for Super Bowls. The goal is always the Super Bowl. I remember Kenny Holland, who was the Rebels general manager during their run for the 4 Stanley Cups that they've won. He always said, there's a difference between winning a Stanley Cup team. There's a difference between a Stanley Cup winning team and a team that's just going to get in the playoffs and fizzle out. And I've always looked at that as kind of like the barometer. We've seen the Tigers go to the World Series and fall apart. We've seen, the Pistons go to the championship and win because they had the team to compete for the championship. We have not seen the Lions build a team where you can compete for a championship. I think Brad Holmes is changing that narrative. And listen, it'll be interesting to see what happens at the draft, because I think that Brad Holmes has a few moves up his sleeve. But hats off to Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, because what they've been able to do is really just, it's refreshing, because this is exactly what for years, if you've been following the Detroit Lions news page, I've been telling you, the reason that the Detroit Lions can't win is because they don't have the general manager that's going to make the right decisions. And I can confidently say right now, the Detroit Lions do have that general manager, and they do have the coach. It's going to be a fun year for the Lions, so if you're new to the channel, subscribe to the channel. We're going to bring you Lions content. We're going to have Rebels and Tigers and Pistons content as we move forward to a lot of Lions content leading up to the draft, so stay tuned for that. And we'll see you on the next video.